In the previous video, we talked about this aspirin molecule, and we said that this is probably a component that's going to be in the drug that we're going to give you in the lab to analyze. And I told you that in this video, we'll look at the third component that should be present. But before I really do that, we talked about aspirin and we talked about it precursing or coming after, really, so not really a precursor. The precursor of aspirin was salicylic acid, and then they weakened it down and they made acetyl salicylic acid for that reason. However, there is also another compound that I think would be an appropriate time to talk about now, and this compound is called acetaminophen. And acetaminophen is not the same as acetyl salicylic acid. And this also goes by another name of paracetamol or cetamol. And acetaminophen is very similar to aspirin, but it's not aspirin. It's an aspirin alternative. So what you'll see is that this is a ring structure, and it's got a ring in the center, so it's kind of benzene derived. And then off on one side, you're going to see an OH group that's going to be present. And this is a group that we have seen that's pretty common now based on the structures that we've seen so far in the lab. And then over here, para, which means directly across from each other, we see a nitrogen that's then bonded to a carbon that has a double bond O, and then it goes out to another carbon. And this nitrogen has a hydrogen on it as well. So this is the structure for acetaminophen or paracetamol. And just keep in mind, para, because this will become important much later on in organic, basically means directly across from each other. So here's the OH group. There is the nitrogen-containing group. They're directly across from each other on this ring. They're at spot number 1 and number 4. And that's what we call para, spot 1 and 4, or directly across from each other. So, like aspirin, this stuff does some pretty similar stuff, right? Number 1, it can treat fever. Number 2, it can treat pain. Number 3, it can treat stuff like headaches as well. Not a big deal with it. But the problem here is that there's issues with it that we have to be really careful about. Very high doses of acetaminophen, more than 4 grams per day. And this is why you should always read the ingredient or the directions on the ingredient label on the back of the pills. If you take more than 4 grams of acetaminophen a day, this can actually cause liver failure. And no one wants you to die of liver failure over a headache that you might have. So you need something else. If you're having that headache all the time, you need to go to the doctor and have it checked out. People are also maybe allergic to it in some way. So people have reported skin rashes if they take very high doses. So that's something that also you want to take a look out for. If you're starting to itch, if you're starting to dig, if you break out into a rash, don't take it anymore. Use some common sense. Also, this does not prevent blood clotting. So people take an aspirin to thin out the blood, but this acetaminophen does not work the same way. That is not the purpose of taking acetaminophen. Salicylic acid and acetyl salicylic acid, maybe. But acetaminophen does not cause your blood or it doesn't prevent the blood from clotting, and it does not reduce inflammation. So if you have swelling, this is not going to help the swelling part. Aspirin will, but acetaminophen does not. And this is kind of one of the reasons that it's deemed safe for children. It's safe for kids to take this acetaminophen stuff, but you never really want to give them aspirin. You want to give them the aspirin alternative, okay? Well, this had to come from somewhere, right? So where did this come from? Well, this first started with a drug called acetanilide, acetanilide, acetanilide or acetanilide. It's the first aniline that was discovered that showed analgesic properties. All right. So that basically means fever, pain, all of that stuff goes away. People can take it. It's safe for you as long as you have controlled doses. The issue here, though, is very similar to how salicylic acid was discovered. It's a little too potent. And because of that, we weaken it down. So they weaken it down to something called phenacetin. And this is another play on the drug that we're using in this lab. So acetanilide goes to a drug called phenacetin. Phenacetin, phenacetin. And that should be closer together. I don't know why I hiccuped like that. The issue, though, is that both of these drugs cause cancer. Yeah, great, huh? We spent years giving people acetanilide and phenacetin, and then we realize that this drug causes people cancer, and then we take the drug away and say it's not safe anymore, you can't take it. So sorry, we're going to have to substitute it with something. And what they substituted it with was another nitrogen-containing compound. So acetanilide had nitrogen related. Phenacetin was the same way, related from acetanilide. This was too potent. The first one was too potent. Then they tried it again, and they came up with acetaminophen or paracetamol. And this is pretty safe. This is the safe substitute. Well, the consumer doesn't know what acetaminophen is. Most of them don't, at least. And what is acetaminophen? This is Tylenol. So give kids Tylenol, but do not give them aspirin. They are totally different structures. They are different components. They are different drugs. They have nothing alike, either chemistry-wise or structure-wise. You have to be very careful. Now, if I look at the structure, I do see an OH group that's present. Okay? That OH group is polar, but I see a lot of this other non-polar stuff that's out here instead. Think of sugar. All of those OH groups on it made it dissolve in water really, really well. And then you looked at acetyl salicylic acid, and you saw some groups on there, and it did dissolve in water, but there wasn't as many as sugar. Well, for Tylenol, this OH group is really the only group that's going to allow it to do that. So, for that reason, this is not soluble in water. It's not going to dissolve up for you. The melting point is also a little bit higher. The melting point is 169 degrees versus 130 so for acetyl salicylic acid. So a different melting point, a different solubility characteristic. So in a laboratory, it would be very easy to distinguish these two compounds from each other. If I have a vial that contains one component and a vial containing the other, I put water in it. One will dissolve, the other one will not. The one that dissolves is probably aspirin. The one that does not dissolve is probably acetaminophen. Or I take those into a melting point system and I do a melting point determination of it. And depending on what value I get, it will help me to determine what that unknown component is going to be. All right, so Tylenol is going to be found everywhere, right? Acetaminophen, extra strength. It's kind of an off-brand version here. And then Tylenol, extra strength acetaminophen. Well, the drug's actually called acetaminophen. Tylenol is kind of the company that makes it in a way, but now they're kind of owned by other parties as well. So depending on the year that you're watching this, Tylenol could be bought out by somebody else. But this is basically the aspirin substitute. So there are tons of them, tons of different choices. And here it says, warning, acetaminophen overdose may cause liver failure. Take as directed. And that should be on the back of every single label that you're finding with acetaminophen on it. Okay, now I want to talk about acetanilide and phenacetin because lab number 3 is going to concern these two components. And acetanilide and phenacetin are going to be very important because you're going to have to determine what this unknown is going to be. So we have picked one of these two. and we have put it inside of your pill. And when you go through and calculate percentage, that's great. You can give us percentage of the unknown, and we'll check that number to see if you're close. But then they're going to follow up, and they're going to say, now in experiment number 3, a totally different one, you need to go through and you need to talk about how or why you determined your unknown to be one of these two. How did you do it? And why did you do it? So I'm going to clear this off for just a second. And we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at the structure for acetanilide. It is another ring structure. And this ring structure has a nitrogen on it, and then a double bond O, and then a CH3 group out here, or just the C. And let me not write that. Let me just draw the line to kind of tell you it goes there, because that's almost identical to what we saw with the acetaminophen. So this is acetanilide, acetanilide. It is made from a group called aniline, Aniline. You'll learn more about anilines later on in the program and later on in organic chemistry course, but this is kind of the parent molecule. And acetanilide is one of the anilines that you would see in a laboratory. This is a suspected carcinogen. So I'm going to put it causes cancer. Then I'm going to put a question mark after it because they believe that it does, but they haven't really fully proven that this molecule is one of the culprits that causes it. It's got pain relieving properties just like aspirin, just like acetaminophen or Tylenol now. And it was used in the medical market years and years ago, but no longer. Years into the release, it was discovered that acetanilide caused cyanosis, which is low oxygen content. So not only did it have liver problem, but people that took maybe too much of it often experience this symptom called cyanosis. And I'll show you a picture of cyanosis in just a second. But severe liver damage was associated with it. Severe kidney damage was associated with it. And because of that, phenacetin came out onto the market. So Phenacetin. And phenacetin, or acetanilide, soluble in hot water, and the melting point is 114 degrees. All right? So phenacetin maybe will take on a little bit of different structure. It will take on some different properties, but we already see that acetanilide is soluble in hot water, and the melting point is a little bit lower. 114 is what we're finding out. Okay, so what does cyanosis look like? What were these people experiencing? Well, they would go home and they would take this pill that their doctor prescribed, and they would say, wait a minute, this is kind of what's happening to me. I'm going home and I'm taking this pill and you've prescribed it, and I'm trusting you because you have a doctor and you have a white coat that you wear every day. But yet when I take this, I see purple and blue extremities on my toes and my fingers. Tell me what's happening. Well, this was another side effect that was happening with acetanilide, and this was called cyanosis. If you look at the old school containers, compressed tablets, 100 of them, acetanilide, that's an old school or old spelling for it. Both of these are still accepted with the E at the end or without the E. And then over here it says laxative. Each tablet contains 1 grain. Acetanilide for colds and simple headaches. The first and original cold tablet for 50 cents. And you get 40 of them. Whoa. All right, so that's a little bit about acetanilide, and this is a structure that you might have in your unknown drug component. All right, well, phenacetin. Phenacetin is a different drug, so therefore it has a different structure. And this also has a ring, and off of this ring is an oxygen. and then there's a carbon attachment, and then another carbon attachment, so there's a total of 2. And then up here in the para position, which is directly across from each other, I see the nitrogen with the hydrogen, just like this up here at the top. And then nitrogen attached to a carbon that's double bonded to an O that then is out to an CH3 group. It's modified, right? It's a different form. It's similar, but it's a different form. There's a different group that's present. So the molecule was thought to be safer. That's why they released it. And it was used from 1887 to 1993. Yeah, 106 years of this drug being on the market. Bayer was the supplier of this drug, just like they were with aspirin. But the FDA banned it after 106 years. They finally discovered that 100 years worth of studies showed that this drug did cause cancer. It did damage liver, and it did damage kidney. Don't you have trust in your EPA or your FDA now? A government organization started in the early 1900s, looked at a drug that had studies, over 100 years worth of studies, and they determined that this drug was unsafe after that many number of years. In the meantime, people that took it, too bad liver, too bad kidney, hello cancer. This is also a very common ingredient used to adulterate cocaine. So if you see a sample of cocaine, and I hope that you don't, but if you do, note that cocaine is probably not fully cocaine. It's a mixture. It's a wonder drug. There's who knows what in it. Depends on what people have in their garage at the time, probably. And there's going to be a little bit of cocaine and a little bit of mixer, a little bit of bonder. And that mixer or that bonder is very often phenacetin if people can get their hands on it, or it used to be. This was great. It was an alternative. It was a drug. You could snort it just with cocaine. And it was a headache cure and fever reducer and inflammation reducer. So, a little bit of bad with the good, I guess is how they saw it. This stuff is also soluble in hot water. Not as good, though, but it does dissolve in hot water. So acetanilide has a greater solubility in hot water than phenacetin does. The melting point on this structure, it's a little bit higher. It's 135 degrees. So that's a little bit about the chemistry of these unknown drugs, either phenacetin or acetanilide, that you might have in your drug sample. Here are some pictures of phenacetin. Notice that these tablets mix caffeine with it as well. So take one of these and your headache will go away and your caffeine will make you feel real good. Here in the center, 10 cans, aspirin, phenacetin, and caffeine. So they just decided to give you a whole cocktail mix full of drugs. And then over here to the right, you'll see another old bottle that says Salol and phenacetin. And it's targeted toward children. Compound for children is what it says down below. Kind of sad, kind of scary. But thank you, EPA, or the FDA, for doing what you did. Okay, so we need to take a look at a comparison table. So here I've got a table that just kind of sums up all the information that we've talked about so far. Sucrose, it's soluble in cold water, but aspirin, acetanilide, and phenacetin is not. And then the melting point, we can't really get one for sucrose, but we can get a melting point for the other three components. Notice, though, that phenacetin is the same melting point as aspirin. And then down here below are pictures of acetaminophen, acetanilide, and phenacetin. Note how they're different, right? Acetanilide is where it started. This was kind of the parent molecule. Phenacetin came next, which is over on the right-hand side. So they acylated the group. They put 2 carbons on it. and then they decided this was bad, so they chopped off that piece and they put an OH group on there instead, and that's what you see in the first diagram, and that is acetaminophen, which we will call Tylenol. All right, so how are we going to separate these things? That's what the next video will talk about. So we're almost finished, I promise. We just have a couple of more things to go through. So come back, we'll talk about the separation technique, and that way you'll be prepared when you go into the lab.